everyone. My name is Lindsey Nichols. I'm the Marketing and Business Development Manager at the Society of Illustrators. Normally this event would be hosted in our museum located in Manhattan, but since we can't meet in person, we're happy you're joining us here in this virtual space. So thank you for being here this evening. We're really excited to be partnering with Kickstarter to bring you tonight's presentation, How Alternative Comics Found a Home on Kickstarter with Oriana Leckert and Ganzeer. Before I introduce the panelists and they get started, I just want to mention that if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and at the end we'll have some time to answer. So Oriana is the Senior Outreach Lead for Publishing, Comics, and Journalism at Kickstarter, where she helps creators bring a broad range of literary projects to life. She's written and edited for Vice, MTV News, Slate, Hyperallergic, and many more. Her book, Brooklyn Spaces, 50 Hubs of Culture and Creativity, grew out of a multi-year project chronicling the rise and fall of under-the-radar creative spaces across New York City. And artist and designer Ganzeer operates seamlessly between art, design, and storytelling, creating what he has coined concept pop. His medium of choice, as described in Artforum, is a little bit of everything: stencils, murals, paintings, pamphlets, comics, installation, and graphic design. With over 40 exhibits to his name, Ganzeer's work has been seen in a wide variety of galleries, impromptu spaces, alleyways, and major museums around the world. His current project, a sci-fi graphic novel titled The Solar Grid, is a recipient of Foreign Policy's prestigious Global Thinker Award and was successfully crowdfunded on Kickstarter. So I know they put together a really great presentation for us this evening. So Oriana, if you want to get started.
Yay. Thank you, Lindsey. Thank you, Society of Illustrators, for having us. We're really excited to do this talk. Yeah, we have a whole cool deck. We're going to switch off. Ganzeer is going to share first, and he's going to talk about his stuff, and then I'm going to talk about mine. And we're just really excited to share all the ways that Kickstarter has helped indie, alternative, and underground comics thrive while helping creators outside of the mainstream build community around their work and realize their artistic dreams. Cool. Ganzeer, go ahead, take it.
Sorry, it took me a minute to figure out how to unmute. I guess I should talk a little bit about The Solar Grid, which is the graphic novel I'm currently working on and was successfully crowdfunded through Kickstarter. Before I get into the graphic novel itself, since we are talking about Kickstarter, I think talking about some facts or like numbers and things are quite important to highlight. So the project was initially raised over $48,000 on Kickstarter. This was for a dedicated hardback collected edition. It was later part of a graphic narrative campaign that Radix Media, another publisher, ran on Kickstarter, for which they raised over $27,000. And this was, the Solar Grid is only one part of their publishing program. So, how much of that is kind of allocated to publishing the Solar Grid in particular, I don't know. And this is for like a serialized edition that they're putting out starting in April 2021. In addition to that, the chapters, I serialize them digitally at thesolargrid.net through downloadable PDFs that are offered for as low as $2. And this makes the material available at a lower price point because, of course, the printed editions are kind of like low print runs, so they end up being quite expensive. And so this makes it available to a wider audience, and the audience continues to grow in the lead up to the release of the printed editions. And the graphic novel, although not yet complete, it has been awarded a Global Thinker Award from Foreign Policy, which I suppose is worthy of note because I think it's not entirely common for graphic novels to get a whole lot of attention from that kind of sector. And the graphic novel is the subject of multiple academic research papers. So why is that? What is the solar grid and what is it about? The solar grid tells the story of what happens after the Earth suffers from a global flood. What this does is that it prompts people to migrate to Mars. So it causes a large exodus to Mars, but of course, as you can imagine, not most people do get left behind on Earth, and only kind of the privileged class, if you will, gets to make the move to Mars, but not before transforming the Earth into a global factory by way of what is called the solar grid, which is basically this network of colossal satellites that orbit the planet and keep it basked in eternal daylight. This is made possible by absorbing the rays of the sun and beaming it concentrated down back to Earth. And this basically powers these solar powered factories on Earth that run 24/7, primarily to produce goods for export to Mars. And the waste is then sent back to Earth, rendering the planet a kind of landfill. So basically, the Earth becomes a landfill as well as a factory, a planetary factory, essentially for the benefit of Mars. And most people who are left behind on Earth essentially now live on a planet that has become increasingly uninhabitable. The story follows two orphans on Earth, Mehet and Kamin, who rummage through the waste on Earth to find lucrative items that they could sell and live off. And they come upon an item that causes a chain reaction, basically, that leads to the destruction of the solar grid. Now that's kind of like as much of a straightforward pitch as the graphic novel can handle, but it actually isn't so straightforward. It kind of encompasses a many hundreds of years, and kind of covers this entire history that explores how the solar grid came to be and all the resistance efforts throughout its development to keep it from happening, and eventually leading up to where the story of the two orphans takes place. So some of the key dates that are featured in the graphic novel, we have 1818 AD, 2019 AD, and then after that we have 9AF. AF does not stand for what it is typically used on social media these days. It stands for after the flood. So of course, after the event of a global flood, you can imagine that the dating system would kind of would have to restart, right? It's a big event that affects everyone on the planet, affects history, and so we have a kind of restart of the dating system with the big flood. And so, this kind of offered an opportunity for some formal experimentation in graphic narrative for me. In that I figured I could, like, for each and every kind of time frame, for one reason to differentiate, but also to kind of evoke a certain sense of the time. I could use a different style, a different illustrative style. So for 1818 AD, opting to do something that is of that period, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. You had kind of a lot of cross-hatching and use of cross-hatching in the illustrations of printed matter at the time. I have not yet gotten to the 1818 AD part in the book, so I'll just jump to the 2019 AD. So for 2019 AD, I have this basically takes place in Japan in 2019 AD, and I wanted to kind of draw on the influence of manga, but not really in the superficial sense. You know, sometimes you find a lot of these how to draw manga books where you get kind of a stereotypical idea of what manga should look like. Maybe faces look a certain way or something. For me, I was more interested in the essence of manga, kind of the pacing, how kind of stories are paced in manga quite often. So I drew from that. Some things I noticed in terms of just the spacing, for example, between in the gutter spacing. So oftentimes you find horizontal gutters are a bit wider than vertical gutters. The number of panels on a page, the space around, like the kind of white border that goes all around the page, except for the occasional panel that would like cut through to the edge of the page. Things like that, you know. So that was a lot of fun to draw on. For the year 9 after the flood, given that it's like really early on in the history of the flood, I wanted to like make everything look very wet, very moldy, and so you find a lot of use of mixed media here to get that effect, you know. For 378 after the flood, this is actually a flashback scene in the book. So, for example, I felt like a nice kind of a really kind of whimsical brush strokes would evoke the sense of a flashback. The lack of kind of panel borders where everything's kind of bleeding into each other, all of the flow of events, you know. I felt that kind of was a good evocation of a flashback scene or kind of memory. For 474 after the flood, so at this point in the story, it's been many hundreds of years since the flood. The solar grid is already constructed at this point, but not activated all hours of the day. It's only partially activated, so you have the flooding has subsided a little bit. People have learned how to live with the floods. Things are a bit cleaner now. And then for 949 after the flood, which is kind of the main storyline, I use kind of this very high contrast, stark black and white look for the vast majority of panels, except when the solar grid is activated. When solar grid is activated, then you find that the shadows are entirely eliminated. The line art becomes extremely thinner. There is a lack of shadow entirely because light is coming from all directions, you know, and things look extremely kind of, there's a sense of that overexposure in a sense of the entire world. I suspect this, given that this is like a Society of Illustrators kind of talk, illustrators might be into this kind of all these different illustration approaches. And then still within that timeline, we have events that take place on the moon. And so for the moon, I also wanted to kind of have these scenes very easily differentiated from all the scenes that take place on Earth. So I opted to kind of use this sort of periwinkle color and this kind of not quite purple, not quite navy blue, somewhere in between color instead of the blacks. And that kind of gave an effect of this, what to me felt like a lunar glow almost. And you'll also notice that I abide by a very, very strict 4-panel grid throughout all of these lunar scenes. even though no one hates working, like doing comics, like grid, like sticking to a grid more than me. I just cannot stand it, but it made sense of the story because I figured, for the moon, the passage of time on the moon would seem very, very still compared to Earth. The moon, of course, rotates very, very, very slowly around its axis, extremely slowly. So it would seem like it's like time is almost still on the moon compared to Earth. And abiding by this strict 4-panel grid seems to me felt like it would evoke that sense a lot. And I also have scenes that take place on Mars. And for Mars, this is where we see kind of an explosion of color for the first time in the book. And this doesn't happen until like chapter 5. So you're going through, mostly black and white book. And then the idea is that you would be hit by this color primarily because Mars, for people to be able to cope with life on Mars, there's a lot of virtual reality and augmented reality in place. And so this for the whole world to seem almost unreal in a sense, I felt like having introducing color would capture that effect. There are some other stylistic choices you will notice. The gutters, like behind the panel, the main panels, the color panels, there's all this other stuff going on, and that's essentially this kind of shared network called Hively that they're all connected to in their heads. So think of it as like the internet, but in your head. So there's like media and advertising and people talking, all that is happening at the same time as we follow the main events, and it's sort of like a constant flow. So having that kind of take over the backgrounds, I felt would evoke that sense as well. All the panels you'll notice are square. They're not the same size. It's not a grid. They're all square, which to me was a way to sort of say, but not really say, that everything in Mars kind of fits in a box, right? There's a kind of a place for everything on Mars, and there isn't really room to stray away off of away from the status quo, so to speak. But not all the squares are equal. So there is kind of the illusion of freedom and joy, if you will, on Mars. So that's kind of like the summary of the solar grid. Where does the solar grid fit in the landscape of comics? And it is a weird book. It's an odd book. It isn't really like any other book. So on one hand, you could say, well, maybe it doesn't fit at all. On the other hand, you could say, well, it fits perfectly because in my mind, all of the kind of milestone comics that have occurred, within this medium, they're all really weird comics. They all came out of left field, and that applies even to something as what we see as standard as Superman today. For one, if you look at early Superman, it was not, right here, the first image, it was not categorized as a superhero comic. It's described as a science fiction story in cartoons. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, in their minds, they were making a science fiction story. Superheroes did not exist as a concept back then, and when you look at Superman, early Superman, compared to other comics that existed at the time, which were basically the newspaper strips, it is largely the work of amateurs. It has more in common with the zine today than it does with the mainstream comic. The early the comic strips that were being published at the time, whether it was Dick Tracy or Little Nemo in Slumberland, or Tearing the Pirates. All of these were done by seasoned professionals who were like in their 40s and very, very much, at the top of their craft. But then you have like Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They're both, in their early 20s, and they're doing this thing that really looked kind of amateurish compared to like that really kind of professional stuff. On top of the fact that, it looked nothing like you saw on television, for sure, right? It definitely didn't look like anything you read, whether it was, in the pulps or other types of fiction. Even though it had its inspiration from a lot of the pulps, the end result is something that's like completely different. And you could say the same really for all of the kind of big milestone graphic novels and comics, whether we're talking about Mouse, which was independently published initially in Raw. You think of that at the time it came out, absolutely nothing like it, whether, not just that it was an autobio comic, not just because it was, or not autobio, but a kind of biography, I guess, or because it was about the Holocaust, but like all of that entire combination, right? The biography aspect, the Holocaust aspect, the using animals to tell the story aspect, the style even, the same goes for Palestine. When it came out, it was published by Fantagraphics in 1996. Fantagraphics at the time was like a very small publisher, not what it was today. So you think of this kind of weird journalism comics in 1996, it's like really weird and interesting. And even like, when I read like really early Spider-Man, Steve Ditko Spider-Man, it actually reads closer to like a Daniel Klaus kind of social comic, more so than actually a superhero comic. Like Peter Parker isn't concerned with being a superhero and wanting to save the day as much as he's like this weird, unlikable kid in school who's like a nerd. He gets bit by this spider and he's dealing with all these body changes. It's like a really interesting comic and has very little to do with what we understand based on like mainstream superhero comics that are being done by corporations today. And so, in short, I find that that kind of the driving force of not only the medium, but you could argue like for culture at large, does come from this sort of left of field outsider comics that wouldn't traditionally find a place at kind of big publishing houses. Of course, a lot of these stuff are now being done by big publishing houses, but it always takes that first, someone taking a chance on them. And you find that that actually, like all of these comics, when they were first came out, didn't come by, were not produced by big publishers. They were produced by people who had little knowledge of publishing industry, or little, and just were interested in trying out new things. And so there isn't really I find that there isn't really much of a place for that, within the publishing field. There are like so many gatekeepers in place, which for some reason now is being thought of as people who have are barometers of quality, in a sense that they ensure a certain quality to the product, when I find that actually it has more to do with ends up stifling creativity, stifling invention, and making sure things fall into certain molds. So I would argue that, if we agree that the driving force of the medium and culture at large does come from this sort of outsider creators, people who come from left field, then you could also make the case that the driving force for our culture at large going forward is definitely a place like Kickstarter, So with that, I'll let Oriana take the floor and expound on her experience with her knowledge of comics that have been funded on Kickstarter.
Thank you. That was so cool. I really enjoyed that. We did not, practice this beforehand, so that was all new to me as I was watching it. I am going to share my screen now. There we go. Cool. Yeah. So thank you, Ganzeer. Before I start talking about some of the really important campaigns that kind of mark how Kickstarter became a home for independent comics, I wanted to share a look at where Kickstarter Comics is right now, more broadly. Since the company launched in 2009, more than $130 million have been pledged to the comics category by nearly 900,000 backers, and more than 10,000 comics projects have been brought to life because of it, which is so cool. Despite 2020 being an all-around cursed year, somehow this has turned into Kickstarter Comics' best year ever, and not by a little bit, by a mile. 2019, which was our previous best year for comics, raised just shy of $17 million. This year, comics has raised more than $25 million. And the success rate in the category is sitting at about 74%, which is more than double the site average. So it's like a really good time to be crowdfunding comics on Kickstarter. This didn't happen out of nowhere. Kickstarter is proud to be a home for weird, unusual, and alternative creative ideas, particularly in an industry that has long been dominated by and catered to the tastes of straight, cis, white men. We are thrilled that artists outside the mainstream have come to call our platform home. One of the early pioneers to realize Kickstarter's potential for alternative comics is cartoonist and publisher Spike Trotman, founder of Iron Circus Comics. She launched her first campaign just a few months after Kickstarter was born, and she raised 13 grand for a comic book guide to frugal living. But it was her Smut Peddler anthology that really started to change the game. Billed as sex-positive, lady-driven, dirty comics, the first Smut Peddler was 350 pages of indie erotica from female and gender nonconforming artists, a far cry from standard issue superhero fare. Spike raised more than $80,000 for more than 2,000 backers with that campaign, and she also set the template for how to frame, message, and market a comic book project on Kickstarter. A huge swath of the projects on our site today still follow her formula. One of Spike's enduring and most generous innovations was to leverage the community building that's inherent in crowdfunding to ensure that her rising tide really lifted all the boats. From that very first Smut Peddler, she structured her stretch goals so that with each benchmark a project hits, all of the artists and contributors get more money. This is helpful for the project because it encourages everybody to pitch in and help promote, but more importantly, it centers the artists, making sure that the creative people doing the work get to enjoy the spoils of its success. A few years ago, Spike told the Chicago Tribune there have been more Black female astronauts than Black female headline writers for comic book companies. I opted out of that path. By that point, Iron Circus had run 14 campaigns and raised more than $1 million on Kickstarter. Their latest project, the 6th Smut Peddler anthology, which just closed last week, marked Spike's 38th campaign and raised $116,000. It overfunded so massively that the stretch goals included 19 raises for her contributors, effectively doubling their page rates. Today, Iron Circus is known for publishing innovative fantasy and sci-fi, queer stories, and lady-centric erotica. All of these happen to be subcategories that are incredibly popular on Kickstarter Comics, which is due in no small part to Iron Circus's influence. I talk to creators all day long, and it is amazing how many of them cite Spike and Iron Circus as primary influencers in their decision to bring their work to Kickstarter. Spike jump-started a renaissance in alternative comics on our platform, demonstrating a path forward for non-mainstream artists who want to tell these stories, not to mention thousands of eager backers who want to read them. My next example is one of marginalized creators using Kickstarter to get off the page and off the internet altogether. In 2014, queer nonprofit Geeks Out had a radical idea to create a comics convention made by and for queer artists and fans. As they describe the event, you won't have to scan the floor for a rainbow flag just to find a queer-friendly artist, and you won't have to sift through tables and tables of comics just to find a story with 2 boys or 2 girls kissing. They wanted to create a multi-genre event showcasing queer inclusive pop culture from comics, graphic novels, anime, manga, video games, and more, and they knew they'd find an audience for their alternative comic tastes on Kickstarter. There had been comic conventions campaigns before, including Indiana's Appleseed Comics, an art convention, and Sonic the Comic-Con in the UK, not to mention a vast array of queer comics. But Geeks Out went a step further than just raising money to fund their con. They used their campaign to start building the community that would become their attendees. FlameCon was planned as a day filled with panel discussions, workshops, and exhibitors. So the creators structured their reward tiers to include artist tables and vendor booths, as well as happy hours with queer comic artists before and after convention day. After raising nearly 20 grand from more than 300 backers, Geeks Out threw the first FlameCon in Brooklyn's Grand Prospect Hall in 2015, and it was a huge success. So much so that in subsequent years, the convention expanded to 2 days and now takes place in a much larger venue. As a reporter put it in Them magazine, there's nothing like the electricity in a room filled with thousands of queer nerds. FlameCon has since become the largest LGBTQ comics convention in the world. This year, of course, the in-person convention was canceled due to COVID, but there was a day of virtual events over the summer with talks on topics like comics and advocacy, working as a marginalized creator in multiple mediums, and creators of queer comics for kids. After FlameCon's success, there have been so many more campaigns like it on Kickstarter. We've seen standard cons in Nashville, Palm Springs, Albuquerque, and Cincinnati, an all indie comics expo in Chicago, and some other niche, extremely 2020 virtual cons like the Naughty Fairies Online and the Comic Unity Convention, a home for creator-owned comics and cosplay, where attendees could determine the complexity and expense of their swag bag based on their reward tiers. At this point, Kickstarter has been pretty well established as a place for people opting out of the traditional comics industry to fund their work. But even those within the industry have chosen to use our platform for their alternative, unusual, and beautiful ideas. One example I really love is Tanika Stotts, an award-winning Black queer comics creator and animation writer. She's been nominated for an Emmy and has won Lambda, Ignatz, and Eisner Awards. She's also written for Steven Universe, Craig of the Creek, and My Little Pony. And she funded 3 comics anthologies on Kickstarter, all of which center and uplift queer and marginalized voices and creators of color. Tanika has raised more than 200 grand from her Kickstarter projects, and the campaigns have helped her build her lauded comics practice and her sustainable comics business. And just as she uses her own platform to uplift diverse voices, she designs her anthologies to do the same throughout the comics community. Each anthology is anchored by big-name artists, but also includes pieces by emerging voices, giving some of them their first big break and showcasing new talent throughout the industry. And there's been plenty of other creators on Kickstarter who came up in the mainstream comics world. Mike Barron recently funded Florida Man. Jimmy Palmiotti is live right now with volumes 3 and 4 of Popkill, and also currently live is Aquarius, the Book of Myrrh by Afua Richardson, an Eisner-winning African native illustrator and musician who's worked on Black Panther and Lovecraft Country and has done covers for Marvel. There are so many more like this, projects by artists who have garnered mainstream accolades and success working for major comics publishers, but who decided when they're ready to turn their efforts to bringing the stories they want to tell into the world, that the best place to do it is Kickstarter. That's what I've got. Before we finish and open up for any questions, I wanted to make a little plug. Every January, Kickstarter runs a prompt called Make 100, where we invite creators of all kinds to design a campaign where they create 100 of anything. Especially given the bleak COVID winter that we are heading into, I think this is a really lovely way to make space for bright, whimsical, joyful, creative projects in the new year, and to start it off in a really beautiful way. Historically, this prompt has been super popular in the comics community. People have drawn 100 monsters, sketched 100 panels, stapled 100 mini-zines, painted 100 yellow birds. The list goes on and on. It's also a really nice starter project if you've never run a campaign before, because it's very finite and manageable. If you're interested, there's more information at kickstarter.com/make-100. And please send me what you're working on. I would love to see if I can help. Here's our info. I included my email address, but not Ganzeer's. Wasn't sure if that would be cool. But you really can email me if you want to share projects that you're thinking of doing, projects that are live. If you want to ask me questions about comics Kickstarters, this is literally my job. So I'm super happy to hear what you're working on.
Wow, thank you so much. That was great. And, you know, it's really nice to hear that it's a good year to get projects funded on Kickstarter. It's nice to hear some good news. And Ganzeer, it's like incredible how many different styles you have, and awesome to see that you didn't just confine yourself to one. So really amazing. I, like everyone else, am seeing this for the first time too. So it was really, really great. We do have one question from the attendees. It's, how can or does Kickstarter collaborate with bookstores, comic shops, and libraries for procurement opportunities to spread the support of indie comics and help strengthen their sales too, if the creators want that?
Yeah, I mean, that mostly happens on the creator side. There are a lot of comics campaigns that have a retailer reward tier where they'll sell 10 or 20 or 50 copies of the book. I know that there are actually comic retailers who watch Kickstarter. I'm not sure that we have any mechanism to like foster distribution into traditional book selling channels, but we also do campaigns with bookstores, including comic book stores. I think that, you know, the community is all there kind of helping each other. And there is a lot of movement on the site from, you know, from creators to backers to sellers. I don't know if that's a really good answer, but, you know, pretty much Kickstarter creates the architecture and the platform for you to raise the money to do what you want with your book. And I think a lot of retailers are really happy to stock, especially in the comics world, books that have not been traditionally published or distributed.
Thank you. And I was just having a question for Ganzeer. Like, your story, it's so complex. Did you know the full story before you started, or is this something that you're just continuing to create as you go along?
Yes and no. So kind of like Kickstarter, I had the architecture, for the story. I knew how I wanted to start it. I knew how I wanted to end it, you know, with the destruction of the solar grid, right? The question is, and I did have like a general structure for like where each timeline is going to fall in terms of chapter breakdowns and stuff like that. It's the details that I left to work on in the process, right? Where certain characters were invented along the way of the making of the book. The dialogue, of course, just comes as I'm making each scene, you know. So essentially, there's just the only thing I had was really like a structure, and the impetus and the reason, I guess, for wanting to make the book. There was a point to it in my mind, but the creation process itself along the way is just left wide open, and which you can, I don't know if you could tell when you read it or not. It's probably going to be one of those. It's going to be one of those things where for some people it might seem like, oh, this really wanders, but for other people it might seem like, oh, this must have been planned exactly this way all along, right? But having that room for me is important, so it doesn't feel like colored by numbers. Yeah. You know, the whole creation process, which unfortunately, you know, a lot of publishers want to know exactly every little thing before, you know, you work on the project. If they're going to take it on and they want to publish it, unless you have worked with them before and they already trust you and your process and all that stuff, right? But I think one of the hurdles for a lot of newcomers into the field is like publishers want like this very, very tight, very, very tight pitches where the whole thing is really mapped out like in complete detail, which I think stifles a lot of the creation process in my mind.
Yeah. So it gives you that opportunity to have that freedom, which is, yeah, really important. How did the idea of the solar grid come up?
That's a very good question. The idea came about because, you know, I was through a lot of my art projects prior to working on the solar grid. I was doing a lot of various kind of work that tackles social justice issues, and it would always be like one piece per thing. You know, I would do one art piece for that had to do, for example, with police brutality, or one art piece on sexual harassment, or one art piece on the kind of relationship between between capitalism and environmental destruction, so on and so forth. And so after a while of doing that, I started to see kind of like the connection between all these things. And I really wanted to do a project about how all of this is connected and it's not these separate issues, you know? And so that's how the solar grid was born, really, from that, and the desire to tackle kind of that really connection between all these things.
So another question is, how did you end up in the South after being part of the Brooklyn Collective?
Yeah, at the time when I was joining the Brooklyn Collective, I was living in Brooklyn, and I mean, I'm still with them, but I no longer live in Brooklyn. And I ended up in the South because my wife got a job here, man. So we moved down to the South. Like, I guess I don't know if that's an interesting enough answer.
You gotta go where it calls you.
Yeah, exactly.
Anybody else have any questions? I mean, I guess I had a question earlier, but you kind of answered it, which was like, do you draw from your own experiences when you're coming up with the ideas for Solar Grid?
Yeah, for sure. So, you know, drawing from experiences can either be, you know, actual events, or it could just be as simple as things that you see and they kind of stick with you, right? So, you know, there's a big neighborhood in Cairo, which is, you know, where I was born, where I'm from, and it is kind of the garbage collectors district, if you will, and it's essentially where there's an entire community and families of people who work in the garbage collection field. And you know, this was kind of before the kind of the city brought in a company, an Italian company, to take care of trash collection, and they're not actually doing as good as a job as kind of the original garbage collectors were, where basically they would go and collect the waste from the city, bring it back to their neighborhood, and kind of do a very kind of DIY version of recycling, separate plastic, separate metal, separate this, separate that, and do all these things. So the neighborhood where they're essentially like living in the waste was a big part of the vision I had for influence that look for 949 after the flood period, where, you know, the two orphans live in a place called Waste Country, where it is that kind of never-ending landfill, and they go through all the stuff. Things like they go around with this shopping cart, and that I was living in downtown LA at the time, actually, when I first came up, started working on the solar grid, and you know, there's just like a huge homeless population in downtown LA, and you always find people going around with these shopping carts. which is just a striking image because the shopping cart itself is such a facet of consumerism, you know, of modern consumerism in particular, and to see it kind of used in this way where people who are now kind of suffering as a result of this kind of consumer culture and capitalism and so on, and they're kind of living on the fringe, but they have this kind of the remnants of it, and it's not this glamorous thing like going through the supermarket and putting all your stuff in the shopping cart anymore. It's this just carrying your life with you in the shopping cart. So I mean, that was just like a striking image for me, and definitely influenced a lot of the scenes in the Solar Grid. There's a police interrogation scene that I draw from some personal experience in Cairo. You know, there's a lot of stuff that find their way into the work, but masked, of course, through through this being a work of complete science fiction, you know.
So somebody is referencing one of your projects from the Brooklyn collective, Ganzeer's Trouble Trunk, and asking about moving from a high art concept such as that to doing a mass media crowdfunded project such as your current project, and what changed for you moving from those two different projects?
I mean, in my mind, it's all art, and you know, I don't. For me personally, I don't see a differentiation between, oh, now I want to do this high art thing, or now I want to do this mass art thing, as much as I just want to do this art project. You know, some of them happen to be things that can be more easily reproducible, like a graphic novel, and printed in larger quantities. Other things. The nature of the work itself requires that you can only really do it once or twice or whatever. And you know, as an artist, sometimes I just have the impetus. You just have the impetus to make something, and different things need to be made in different ways. And you want to find the perfect. You want to find the perfect medium, the perfect tools that would express a particular idea that you have. You know, and you know, with some of the stuff I did with Brooklyn, you know, the ideas required them to be either a screen print or a screen print combination with hand painted things or a letterpress or something, and the requirement for the idea of the Solar Grid required it for it to be a graphic novel, and you know, it's just what the project is asking, how it's asking to be made, you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's great that we have a platform like Kickstarter where you can take, you know, all these different ideas and bring them to life. And so it kind of answers another question that somebody has, which is, do you consider yourself a fine artist, a comic artist, etc.?
Yeah, like I find these kind of extreme kind of categorizations and specializations, to me, they're just very weird. It seems to be a facet of industrialism or something, where you just think of people almost as machines. Like I produce A, you know, and someone else says I produce B, and you know, we're not really machines, right? So you know, I just think of myself as an artist, full stop, and that is pretty much it. And you know, I don't see, I don't think that if I do like a painting on canvas, that is somehow a higher caliber of art than doing something that is panels on a page. What might differentiate something from it being better or not from other works of art is the content of the art itself. What is it about, right? Like I could still make like a really crappy painting. It wouldn't be high art, you know? And I could also make a really crappy comic that, you know, has no need to be made, or the only purpose of it being made is to prolong the intellectual property of some shady corporation. That is not a work of art either, in my view. So the medium is not the art. It is what the medium is used for is what makes the art. And everything, with that in mind, anything can be a high work of art, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with those sentiments. So does anybody else have any questions? Give everyone a minute. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I'm gonna, again, thank Oriana, thank Ganzeer, tell you again that if you have any questions for Oriana, her email is right there. You can reach out to her. She's happy to answer. You can follow Ganzeer. I put his website in the chat there for you guys. This talk will be available on YouTube, so if you want to rewatch or share it with anyone, it'll be there. I do have to say that if you're located in New York City, just want to let you know that the Society of Illustrators is open. We do have time ticketing that's available on our website. We have 2 exhibits up right now, which is the original art exhibit, which is all children's book artwork. It's our 40th year for that exhibit. And then we have From the Silly to Sublime, it's 100 years of the American comic strip, addition to pieces from our permanent collection. So if you're in the area and that sounds interesting, we are open. We will continue to do free online programs throughout the year. The best way to stay in touch is through our Instagram and Twitter, which is just SOI 128, and also our newsletter, which you can sign up for on our website. And that's it. We're again, thank you, and we hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and we hope you have a good night.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Lindsey. Thanks, Oriana.